So kind of going to start getting into how to actually move things around on our page a little bit and actually create something of a layout. We probably won't get through the whole lecture today, but these are pretty important concepts and also a little bit trickier to understand concepts, so we'll probably kind of quickly review what we get through today on Tuesday and finish out the lecture on Tuesday as well. So, as we've talked about a little bit already, so CSS and HTML, each element is its own box, right? So every element on our page is a rectangle. It's either a block level box, meaning it gets its own line and it has height and width, or it's just an inline box. So it's just, along with the text, it flows with the text, and some properties aren't, honored, like height and width and margin, stuff like that, or padding. So these boxes are kind of like the building blocks for our page layout, right? So we can, sort of think of our page as a series of these blocks. We can change their style. We can move them around on the page to create the layout. So this is where things like div and span become really important because we can use those containing elements to group a number of different elements together, which will allow us to position an entire group of elements together as a group. So for an example, we might wrap an image, a heading, and a navigation list all within a div to create a site header positioned at the top of the page. So it lets us kind of create bigger boxes that contain other boxes, right? So if we think of our page, so we've got a page like this, say we have like a big heading, it's, centered. We've got like some navigation links. Maybe we've got like an image here, and then like a list here or something. And then let's say it's like a blog, so we've got, a title, some other information, and then we've got some, text with an image, something like that. So the way we would start to think of using these boxes to our advantage is how we can group the elements together in divs to kind of create more of a layout. So, like we've got so each of these elements themselves are a box, right? So like each of these links are a box, so on and so forth. This image is a box, this, list is a box, this heading is a box, this little thing is a box, this paragraph is a box, you get it. So what we can do is start saying, okay, well, we've got a heading and kind of header content. So we can wrap all of these elements in a div, and now that's a box that contains all of that. And we can control the properties of this box that contains everything else. We could say, these things are all in one box. We can wrap all of these in one box. So then we can do things like, say we want to move our, blog post down from here a little bit, we can add margin in between these two boxes by applying, margin to this container box rather than like margin to the heading or something, and we can move these around as an element. Or say we want to take this whole, article and squish it and make it more narrow, we can do that by adjusting the containing box. So that's how we'll treat our layout as well, is we'll work with these boxes, these divs or spans in some cases that contain the rest of our elements. So that's where it becomes really important to group your elements together in divs so that we can do those things. And some of it you'll have to, kind of learn as we go. Like you'll say, okay, I want to move all of these elements. Okay, I'll create a div that wraps all of those elements. Things like that. So a really, really important concept to understand in CSS is element positioning. So static positioning is the default. So anytime we haven't adjusted the positioning, static is just what the default position is. It's where every block level element appears on a new line, kind of the default way of doing things. Relative positioning will move an element relative to where it appeared before, so where it would otherwise have been. So relatively positioned elements remain within the normal flow of the document, So it doesn't affect the position of surrounding elements. It just kind of moves it relative to where it used to be. And it also will leave empty space where the element used to be. So if you move something relative, there will be empty space left where it used to be. So if we take, we take this image and we moved it relative, we set it to position relative and we moved it, over here in the middle of the text or something, there's still going to be this big empty space here where it used to be. And it's not going to affect the flow of all the other elements. So our text isn't affected at all. It sort of like just pushes it relative to where it used to be. Show some more examples of all of these in a second. In fact, here's an example. So we'll go over the offset, the top and the left in a little bit. But so we've got 4 boxes here. And box 2, we've set position to relative, and we've moved it a little bit. So you notice it's 20 pixels and over and 20 pixels down from where it used to be. There's empty space where it used to be, right? So this space here hasn't been filled in. It didn't move everything back over, to fill in that empty space. It left empty space there where the element used to be. It also hasn't affected the flow of other elements in the document, right? So this box 3 didn't move. It didn't push it along with it. So 3 stays where it was originally. We're just pushing to relative to where it used to be. So that's useful and important to understand. Absolute positioning is a little bit different, and it positions an element to its nearest positioned ancestor. That's kind of a complicated way of saying it, but it's basically positioning it absolutely relative to its parent, and specifically the first parent that's not statically positioned. So the first parent that has some positioning applied to it. That'll kind of make a little bit more sense in practice. Usually, so if you haven't positioned anything relative or absolute at all, it'll be relative to the body. So the body is the first parent. Generally, that's kind of what we're positioning it relative to. But say you have, a div that you've positioned relative, and then another div inside that div that you position absolute, that it'll be absolute relative to its parent that's positioned relative. If that makes sense. We'll go over some examples in a little bit of how that works. Once you start using it, it makes a lot of sense, and it becomes pretty powerful. It lets you really do some cool positioning. Cool is not the right word, but it's a powerful thing. So again, if no parent elements are positioned, the element will be positioned relative to the body. And one really important thing to know is that absolute positioning removes an element from the normal document flow. So the other elements will be positioned as if it wasn't there. So the rest of the elements will fill in the empty space that would have been left by that element. They don't respect the previous location. It's like you remove it from your HTML, so all the elements kind of reflow, and then you just stick it in somewhere else, is the way the absolute works. So that's important to know. So here's an example. So if we take our 2 box and instead of position relative, we do position absolute, it's now relative to its body. So instead of, 2 originally was here, instead of just, relative to where it used to be, now it's relative to its parent. So it's going to go, the same place as 1 is, except be offset from its parent. And notice 3 and 4 no longer respect that empty space that would have been left. They just fill in the empty space, right? They just fill in the gaps. It's like we've removed it entirely from our HTML, and then we've just kind of put it on top of where we want it to be. So again, the difference being with relative, there's still space where it used to be. We're just pushing it from where it used to be, so it's relative to its original position, and the other elements still respect the position that it used to be in, so there's empty space left. Whereas when we do absolute, we remove it from the document entirely, so the rest of the elements fill in the empty space, and then we're just pasting it back in relative to its parent. Specifically, its nearest parent that's positioned at all, or the body, if no other ones are. Any questions so far? Again, this is kind of one of those things that once you kind of play around with it, you're like, okay, I get it. So it's kind of hard to listen to words and really understand it. But once we do some exercises, we'll do a lab on Tuesday that deals with all of these. So it'll kind of make a little bit more sense then. I also have these examples in a code pen too. So if you download the slides, you can click those links and kind of play around with it there, and that will help illustrate for you. We'll go over those too a little bit if we have time at the end of class. Fixed positioning is a little bit different. So it'll position an element relative to the browser window. So relative is relative to its original position. Absolute is relative to its parent. Fixed is relative to the browser window. So it doesn't care about any other elements on the page. It's just relative to the browser window. They'll stay in the same position when the user scrolls up or down the page. So this is a good way to do like a fixed navigation bar at the top of your site that you want to always show up there. You've seen that on sites before, where it's just always at the top of the page no matter where you scroll. That's the main use case for fixed positioning. Surrounding elements will ignore the space that would have been taken up. It doesn't matter anymore where it used to be. But if you are creating a website header that's fixed, you'll need to add some top margin to the next element in your HTML, so the content won't be covered up by the fixed header. So again, it ignores the space that would have been taken up. So say you've got a page, you've got a fixed header that you want, so you've got your title and some buttons or something, and like a login button. And that's your header, and then you've got the rest of your content. Once you set this to position fixed, this content no longer knows, you set this to position fixed, and this content no longer respects the space it took up. So now, it's like this content here is going to be up here because it doesn't know that element's there anymore. It's like absolute positioning, in that it no longer will respect the space that it used to take. So that's where you just have to add margin top to your content to push it down, so it'll it'll be where you want it. It won't be behind your fixed nav bar. I'll show some examples of that as well. So here's kind of a rough example, just showing that, if you position this box, position fixed, no matter where, if you scroll down in this content, the box is still in the same place. So go ahead and pull up this example too, because it helps a little bit when you can actually scroll. So here we've got this box here. We've got I've kind of constrained the height and width of this just so that we get a scroll bar. But you'll notice as we scroll the content, the box stays in the same exact place because it's relative to the browser window. So for example, if this was let's change this a little bit and make it a we'll do width 100% and height maybe is like 30 pixels, and then we'll do position fixed and top 0 and left, so that it's like a header that would go all the way across the page and have some heading content in it. So it stays there, as we scroll on our page. But you'll notice, we've scrolled all the way up, and this, you can kind of tell, I think there's some margin on there a little bit that's, well, maybe not. But you can kind of tell already that this text up here is kind of overflowing a little bit with where that box is. So that's where you'd have to add a little bit of margin. So say on this, let's target the outer has it. So we'll do like, margin top 10 pixels. so that wasn't even quite enough. You know, something like that to push the content down so that at the top of the page it's not being covered up by our header. So anyway, that's fixed positioning. Let me, real quick, go ahead and show you the examples for relative and absolute. So for relative, if we take this off, and not position it at all, that's where it is, right? That's just the normal document flow. It just shows up. But once we do position relative, it's pushing it relative to where it used to be, and the other elements still respect where it used to be. There's empty space left there. It doesn't change the flow of the document at all, but it just pushes it relative to where it used to be. However, if we change it to absolute, now the elements no longer respect where it used to be because they don't care. We've removed it from the HTML and then we've put it back in. And it's now relative to its parent, not relative to its original position. Let me show you an example too. So let's see, we've got all of these boxes are these divs here. So let's create a new div. Class equals container, and close our container div. Let's take out the position absolute for a moment, and let's move this container div. So container, let's do position absolute, and we'll do like left 200 pixels, top 200 pixels. So we've taken, you know, the div that's containing all of these elements, and we've moved it down to the left. We'll cover those offsets a little bit here in a moment. But so we've moved that quite a bit. So now when we do on our blue box here, position relative, again, still just relative to its original position. It doesn't really matter. It's just moves it relative. But now when we do absolute, it's still relative to its container that's been positioned. So in this case, you know, the container starts right here. You know, our container box is here. So it's relative to the container, not relative to the body anymore. In fact, here's a little bit better way to show this. So let's, instead of positioning this absolute, so let's move it back to where it was, but let's like add a bunch more content to the page. So let's add like let's do a div filler. And then let's take this filler div and make it height 300 pixels. Okay, so that's a good example. So now we've got this div here that you can't see. Well, let's make it so you can see it just to help it make more sense. Background color green. Interesting. Let's do height. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Okay, so this is our, so we've got this filler div up here, and then this is our container div that has our boxes in it, right? So, so again, when we do, you know, position relative on box 2, it's still going to be as we expect. Position relative, it just moves it relative to where it was. So now our container div, we haven't positioned at all. So container, I removed, you know, the style we had before. This container div isn't positioned. position is static on the container div, right? Because it's just the default. There's no positioning. It's only down here because this box is pushing it down, right? So now watch what happens when we change box 2 to position absolute. It moves all the way up there. Anyone know why it moves all the way up there instead of where it was before? It's because it's relative to its parent, exactly. And specifically, it's relative to its nearest positioned parent. In this case, there are no positioned parents, so it's relative to the body. So 2 is now pushed 20 pixels over and 20 pixels down from the body, which is way up here. However, the moment we change this container div to anything, even just position relative, now 2 moves back down here because now it's positioned absolutely, which is relative to its nearest positioned parent, which now is container, so now it's down here. Does that make sense? Any questions? Anybody still super lost? Okay, good. Again, the more you play around with it, it kind of makes sense, but it's really powerful because, we didn't actually move this, we just changed it position relative, and this is a neat trick that I'll do a lot when I want to position something absolutely inside of a parent, but I don't really need to move the parent, but you can set it to position relative, the parent that is, just to get this to work correctly, absolutely relative to it without, you don't have to set the offsets to actually move it, so it's kind of a neat trick to make it absolutely inside of that box instead of to the body. Anyway, again, the lab will kind of go over some more examples of this. And just to complete the example, I guess, let's do fixed on this. So position fixed is relative to the browser window, so it's just going to be all the way up there, and it's always going to be there. We don't really have enough. Let's do another filler box to make it scroll. So now we have scroll, and you'll notice 2 always stays in the same place because now 2 is relative to the browser window. So it's always going to be 20 pixels down, 20 pixels over from the browser window, no matter where the rest of the content is. So we can scroll all we want, it doesn't change the location because it's relative to the window. And you notice also its space isn't respected. It's been removed from the HTML and repositioned. So there's no empty space anywhere where it used to be. So it's important to keep in mind. Okay, fixed positioning, fixed example. So as you've seen, we use the position property to change the positioning of the element. So again, following values, they're just the names of the positionings that we've gone over. So static is just the normal flow. So if we, take this box 2 and say position static. Oops. Now it goes back to where it used to be, right? So static is just the default. You very rarely have to actually say position static, just because if we removed, position entirely, that's going to be where it is, but static is what the default value is. There are some times where if you're dealing with a framework like Bootstrap and you need to, Bootstrap is positioning something absolutely or something and you need to change that, there are times where you might use static to override a framework or something. So again, relative is relative positioning, absolute for absolute, and fixed for fixed. So again, some examples, position relative. Hey, Kraig, you want to go? Thanks. We've kind of covered these examples already. I'll go over the offsets here. I think it's the next slide too. So position relative on a div, we'll move it relative to where it used to be. Position absolute on a div, we'll move it from its original, or from its relative to its parent. You could do like position fixed and 20 pixels up from the on the right to do a kind of like a bottom footer or something that would be attached to the bottom of the browser window. Here's the offset properties. So position determines the positioning, and then we use what are called box offset properties to give the positioning values. So to actually say where it should be positioned. So there's 4 properties available, of which we usually use 2, depending on how you want to do it. So we can do top, left, bottom, or right. Accepts pixel values. It'll also accept percentages and ems. So you can say, offset from the left 20%, and it'll be based on the width, the overall width that it has available to it. You can also use ems. Again, that can get a little bit tricky, but it does work. So the value of the offset properties is the space that the element should be offset from the side of the box. That's not actually accurate, that the position property indicates, but it's the size of the box that you're telling it with your offset. So it's important to remember, it's offsetting it from the side that you tell it. So when you say top 10 pixels, it's saying from the top, push it 10 pixels. Push it 10 pixels down. If you say offset from the left, it's pushing it 10 pixels from the left. So whatever side you say, if you say bottom, it's pushing it up 10 pixels. And you can use negative values. So you could say top negative 10 pixels, and now instead of pushing it down, it moves it up 10 pixels from the top. So that can definitely be useful sometimes. Not necessarily for like fixed or something, but so again, whichever side you choose, so we've got our box here, and if you say, top 20 pixels, it'll go 20 pixels over, 20 pixels down from the top, offset. And then if you say left 20 pixels, it'll go over from the left, and that would be here, and your box would be here if you position it that way. Or if you say bottom 20 pixels and right 80 pixels, your box will be here. That kind of thing. So it's your top, bottom, left, right values are offsetting it from that side of its parent. Does that make sense? Any questions? I think a negative can be used. So I'll use negative a lot for, say you've got a page, and I use negative the most probably for images. So, say this is a page. You've got like a blog post, or a good example is like a profile photo. So like, let's say this is Facebook. So you've got like your header image, cover image, or whatever. You've got this profile photo that's supposed to be here and kind of like overlaps, right? So usually the way I would do that is say I would set the profile photo position absolute probably, or position relative, and say, so if it's position relative, the original position was here, or technically the original position would be like here, but so I'd say position relative, and I'd say bottom 20 pixels, or negative 20 pixels, which moves it down from where it used to be, based on the bottom, down 20 pixels, and then maybe over, left 20 pixels, which will move it over that way. So that's kind of how you would do things like that. That's why you might use negative pixel values to move things in the opposite direction. Okay. So overlapping elements. So sometimes, especially once we start moving things around a little bit, we run into instances where elements will overlap with each other, right? As we saw with moving those boxes around. So when this happens, the elements that appear later on in the HTML will sit on top of those that appear earlier in your HTML. So it's kind of like the CSS last rule property. The further down your HTML gets, it overwrites things that were ahead of it, and they'll show up on top. However, we can use the z-index property to control which element sits on top. So the higher the z-index, the more priority an element is given, and the more on top it will be. So one important note is z-index only works for positioned elements. So if you haven't changed the position of an element, the z-index won't work. So you have to have a position set to something other than static. And it takes a numeric value, and it can be negative. So you can apply negative z-index to, ensure that things show up under other things. So again, the negative values are often needed if you want to move a positioned element behind a non-positioned element, since you can't add greater z-index to the non-positioned element, if that makes sense. So let's go back to our box example real quick. And let's, position relative on this guy. And then say we want 2 to appear behind 3. What we can do is say z-index -10, and now 2 pops behind 3. That makes sense. So it just kind of applies a negative z-index. The z-index for everything by default is 0, right? So negative values will go behind. Whereas if we said z-index is 10, now it appears on top. What we could do too is we could say 3. And first, if we just do z-index, 100, it's not going to do anything. So 3 doesn't now appear on top of 2. That's because 3 is not positioned, so the z-index doesn't apply. But what we could do is, if it was, position relative, as soon as we set position relative, now that z-index does apply, and it appears on top of 2 because it has a higher z-index. Does that make sense? Even if we haven't moved it. I mean, we can move it and say, left -50 pixels to move it over, top 20 pixels to move it down, so that they're kind of overlapping a little bit more. So now it's kind of a, whichever one has the highest z-index. If they're the same, 3 comes after it, so it's going to be higher. But once this is 101, now 2 is going to appear on top because it has a higher z-index. So that can definitely be useful when you're moving things around, but you want something to appear on top. Here's just another example. So over here, if we position it absolute and we moved it 20 pixels down and 20 pixels offset from the left, it's going to appear on top. But once we set z-index to -1, it's going to appear behind those elements. Okay, floating. So the float property allows you to do kind of 2 things at the same time. So it allows you to take an element and move it as far right or as far left as possible within its containing elements. And then it also allows the other elements that sit inside its containing element to flow around it. So float was, kind of designed for, and you can think of it as floating an image inside of text, which images by default are inline, so they're all automatically going to kind of flow within text. But whenever you've got, text, and then, like an image, and then more text, that image is technically floated inside that text. And you can, usually sometimes your word processors will allow you to do this too. This would be floated right, or if it was floated left, it would be over here, and the text would flow on this side of it. So we can use float to say we have other, images, that by default are like this, but if we float them all, now they'll, jump up onto the same line like that. But we're also pushing them as far to the left or as far to the right as possible. So it's really, really useful. So for example, so it takes 3 values, left, right, or none. There's no center or anything, but we could do none to remove the floats. So if we do image float right, it'll move the image as far right as possible, and it allows other elements within the containing element to float around it, even block level elements. So here's an example. So if we do float none on this image, the text will be forced below, or specifically on the div. And then if we do float left on the div, the text will flow around it. There's also a clear property, which allows you to indicate that no element within the same containing element should touch the left or right sides of a box. So basically, it's clearing the float. So you've got a floated element, which would allow stuff to flow, around it. But if you say clear, so clear left or clear right, it will say, okay, don't let anything touch the right side of this element. So clear the float on the right side of it. Or you can do both to say, both sides. So for example, if we have, all of our paragraphs, we say width is 33%, we want them to float left, which means they're going to be pushed as far left as possible. They're going to be at 33% of the page. So what this would do, we've got these paragraphs. There's going to be 3 of them, because they're each going to be 33%. But then the 4th one, we're say clearing left. So the 4th column would clear the float, meaning it would break to a new line. Which this is a bad example, because it would anyway, because the width is only 33%. But say width was 20%. So rather than, something where they could all fit, but instead we still want it to break. So the width is just something like this for each one. We've got 1, 2, and we've got 3. So these are floated left, meaning they're pushed as far left as possible, and it allows other elements to flow up next to it on the same line. So that's why we've got these paragraphs that normally would get a new line, right? Paragraphs are block level elements. Normally each paragraph would be on a new line, but because they're floated left, they float next to each other. But then our 4th paragraph, if we say clear left, we're saying the left side of this paragraph shouldn't touch any other element, and it should definitely get a new line. So our 4th paragraph will be down here. And it can still be floated left. It's only the left side that has to clear the float, not the right side. If we say clear right, then this right side also says don't let anything touch it. So now the next one would be down here. If that makes sense. So this comes really in handy when we're, creating like a layout with a bunch of images, like a collage of images or something, and especially if our content is going to change and be dynamic. If a user has uploaded images and you want to show all those images, you don't want to necessarily say how many should go here or whatever. You can just float them all left. You could say every 5th one, clear the float, something along those lines. It can be useful. Any questions? I'll do some, there might be an example of floats. Well, so here's an example of clearing the float. So we could say, everything, or our boxes are floated left, but our paragraph clears the float. So the paragraph will get a new line. I don't think I have a code example of that, but okay. There's a couple more slides, but we're going to go ahead and call it there, just so we'll go over this briefly on Tuesday as well, and we'll jump into a lab on Tuesday as well that kind of covers these things. So, any questions so far? Okay. Make sure you get your assignment 4 done today by the end of the day. Someone pointed out the due date was actually this morning at like 3 a.m. So I fixed that, so it's now tonight at midnight. So I'll add the next assignment later today, so if you want to get started on it, it won't be due until next Thursday probably. But if you want to get started on it a little bit early, I'll get it posted today. But it's essentially adding some more of the styles that we've learned so far. So some of it's creating some, layouts using our, positioning and our floats and stuff. So we'll cover that a little bit more on Thursday as well, or on Tuesday. Okay, thanks guys. I'll stick around if you need help with anything.